All right, me. This is like 2 minutes later, which is very strange because this will come out way before, because I just finished doing the War and Peace video, or the first part of the War and Peace video. But the other reason I haven't been reading a whole lot recently is that we just wrapped up production on A Little Night Music. Obviously, this is just the playbill, not the whole script. But that's that. Stephen Sondheim's Little Night Music. This is the last thing I'm doing for the Opera House before I move. Fascinating musical. I'm still not quite sure exactly where I stand on it, but fascinating musical. It is Stephen Sondheim, takes place in 1900-ish in Sweden, and basically it is this musical chairs of relationships, and yeah, right, I think that's the best way to describe it. This is a musical chair of relationships, and everyone's starting off with the wrong person and then eventually getting the right person. As well as with all of that, you're dealing with issues of generational splits and how do we raise children properly, and what are the expectations of people as we both raise children but also as we get older, right? For the most part, this follows two families. There's a third family that's thrown in there, but it mostly follows the Egerman family, who is Frederick Egerman, who is a lawyer, his new wife Anne, and Henrik. Henrik is Frederick's son and Anne's stepson, and included within that family is then Petra, who is their servant of sorts, or maid of sorts, housekeeper of sorts, and so that's the main one. The big thing there is that I'll explain the other family first. The other main family is the Armfeldt family, who really consists of three people and then a whole bunch of servants. The first important one is Desiree Armfeldt, who is this is definitely a pretty significant ensemble piece in a lot of ways, but I would say that Desiree and Frederick are definitely the main focus of things. You have Desiree Armfeldt, who is a performer, actress, and is older, or is reaching what would be kind of the end of her career, but is still doing her best to live the life that she has always led as an actress. And then you have her daughter, Frederica, and Desiree's mother, who is just referred to as Madame Armfeldt. I believe her Leandro, right? But that's the Armfeldt family. Madame Armfeldt is this overbearing, I wouldn't even call it overbearing, but this person who has just so many expectations for what should have been done, and leading this life that was risque but also full of meeting dukes and princes and archdukes and whatever, and then you have Frederica, who is kind of caught in the middle of all of this, of where you have this generational split, and Frederica is basically caught in this world of the quote-unquote better life, which is following her grandmother's footsteps, or the quote-unquote more free life, which is following her mother's footsteps, which becomes a big thing there. Yeah. So this is like, the only way I can describe this in a way that makes sense to me is like it is watching the worst high school friend group that are like all in. They have to, like, it's like watching like a whole bunch of band kids and just their relationships and how stupid all of them are, until they eventually find the correct people for them, right? And so you have Frederick Eggerman, who lost his wife at some point and has a son, and then ends up marrying either a 17-year-old or an 18-year-old. We know by the end that they've been were married for 11 months, and she is 18, and Anne Eggerman is 18. So either she is 18, almost 19, or they got married at 17 when she was 17, and is now 18, whatever. But Frederick Eggerman has a child that is actually older than his new wife in Henrik. And so like that's your immediate introduction to this musical, and it is like this. It is tough, and I see why it was not the most well received, because the plot is that, right? It is this whole thing in which you have this very weird relationship to begin with, but then also you have this whole thing in which Henrik is actually in love with his stepmother, but it makes sense because the stepmother is actually his age, and then in the end Henrik and Anne end up running off together and presumably getting married. Frederick this entire time has begun to rehab this affair with Desiree that he had 14 years ago. Turns out Frederica is his daughter. He just doesn't know it, because apparently they hadn't seen each other since that occurred. Desiree is having this affair with Count Carl Magnus. Count Carl Magnus is already married, but is the stupidest idiot that you've ever seen in your life. And he is openly cheating on his wife, and his wife is just kind of dealing with it because he is a count, and therefore they have money, and so she is secure, and so you're dealing with that, and then they all end up going to a weekend of the country, which is probably one of 3 songs that people would actually know. I'd say probably 4 songs that people might know from this Weekend in the Country, which is this massive 10-minute song. And it is just a mess. And through 2 days in the country, everyone works out, everything ends up being fine, of where Anne and Henrik realize that they actually love each other, and then run off, and Frederick ends up with Desiree, and they get to raise Frederica at this point because Madame Armfeld dies. You have this love rekindled with Charlotte and Carl Magnus, because Charlotte intentionally made Carl Magnus jealous, which then leads to them, you do really love me, right? And so it is just watching the worst, like the worst high school relationships, and it is watching a whole bunch of band kids figure themselves out in real time. It is terrible. It is the worst thing in the world in terms of that. You also have Petra end up in some sort of relationship with Frid, who is the main servant for the Armfeld family. Yeah. God, and that's just trying to explain the plot, and it doesn't even make a whole lot of sense. But important things that actually come out of the play, right? The first one is this issue of kind of generational mentality, how do we raise children, because we end up with 3 generations, as I think we very clearly see, right? You have Madame Armfeldt, who is the oldest generation. You have Desiree and Frederick, who are part of this middle generation, and then you have Anne, Henrik, and Frederica, who are part of that last generation, or the youngest generation. And what you see is this thing of where Madame Armfeldt has all these expectations of that they should be exactly like her, right? And then you have the middle generation, who has some of the aspects, right, of where they are choosing to live freely, but they haven't truly grown up, right? Desiree is still is constantly touring around the world, or touring around Europe to try and keep this idea or this concept that she's still this young person and this young actress that is super heavily desirable. You have Frederick, who ends up marrying a 17 or 18-year-old to, as he puts it, rekindle his youth, right? And to still remain young, right? And so you have this middle age that is, they're still trying to be young and they're still trying to be children. And then you have the youngest generation, who are all forced to be adults because their parents weren't willing to be adults, right? And so you have Henrik, who constantly portrays himself as this super serious person, and is, right, needs to do good in the world, and has become a religious fanatic, and is falling apart at the seams because instead of being allowed to, like, not necessarily choose, because he does choose to do this himself, but rather this by being forced to make decisions very early and decide his life incredibly early, instead of being allowed to figure it out, he ends up in the situation of where he is very clearly conflicted but has no way out, and is asked to be an adult with no way out. You have Anne, who is younger than her stepson, but has to try and become an adult and try to become a mother, for no real discernible reason other than an older man wanted to marry her. The huge plot point is the fact that she is still a virgin, which is like another huge plot point is the fact that she has this doll, or it's a minor inflection point is that she has this doll. And so, like, she's very clearly still a child in so many ways, and still very young in so many ways, and yet is being asked and being forced to act like a true adult and act like a parent, when she's clearly not in that position to do so. And then finally you have Frederica, who is like, and just ends up being in the situation of where, like, she's forced to live up to these expectations of her grandmother in Madame Armfeldt because her mother did not, right? And so is being forced to have all this responsibility, and be an adult in so many ways when she is 13 or 14. Right? And that's, that to me is like the huge takeaway of the entire piece, is like this issue with generational raising and what are the expectations we have for children, and should we always trust this idea that we need to always be adults all the time and force people to grow up as fast as they can, or do we let people just kind of fuck around sometimes? So yeah, that's a pretty huge part of the piece. That then also goes into Send in the Clowns, which is probably the most famous song from this piece, which is Desiree Armfeldt kind of coming to terms with this whole idea that, like, she has been trying to keep herself in this, that she's still this super young, super desirable hot commodity in the world, and realizing that is not actually the case. That if she had wanted to live this life that she now wants of settling down and raising a family and doing all these things, that her window is probably closed for that, in terms of she has met the right person in Frederick, but Frederick is married, right? And it is not viable for her anymore unless something massive happens, right? And just this, I fucked up and I screwed up my life because I was so obsessed with still being young and thinking I was going to be young forever, right? Yeah. One of the other things to pull comes from Everyday Little Death, which is probably one of the other ones, probably the second one that people might know from the song, sung by Charlotte Magnus and Anne Egerman, of this realization that the husbands are cheating on them, right? And for women who do not, at this point in time, and still very much at this point in time, is to have the complete and absolute freedom of monetary freedom or legal freedom or personal freedom to do as they so please, right? That in order to live this comfortable life that they both have, or this enjoyable life that they both have, where they don't have to struggle to make ends meet, right? They're allowed to be happy and to be comfortable. They must wake up every day and have this little death inside of that they are supposedly not enough for their husbands, right? Of where for Charlotte, it is this ongoing thing. Charlotte the entire time is very much absent in so many ways from herself and from her husband, and this internal suffering that is constantly occurring because for whatever reason she is not enough for her husband, and yet she can't leave him, right? And then the same ends up going for Anne, of where, right, Anne has sacrificed basically her youth and her life and her future to marry Frederick, who is at least twice her age, maybe even 3 times her age. And then this idea that suddenly that her being who she is just simply not enough because of this whole thing of where she's scared to have sex, right? And that's definitely a huge takeaway from it. The final takeaway from it comes from the Miller's Son, which is, it's placed very, very strangely in the piece. It's such a strange piece because throughout all of this, Henrik is having these issues of where basically he's struggling with his own desire versus the love or the wanting to work in the church, and eventually he's going to take his own life because of this issue. And the way the scenes work out is that he is trying to take his life. Anne walks in, stops him, they run off together, and then the song just starts. There is no, and what's supposed to happen is that they're supposed to be in the same part of the garden. But what's supposed to happen is then that as soon as we see this, a 20-odd-year-old about to take their own life. We then immediately cut to two servants either just about to or having just finished having sex, and then Petra singing the song "The Miller's Son." So it's a very, very strange thing. And then immediately after "The Miller's Son," we then cut to Charlotte and Frederick having this conversation about basically their lives ending and everything falling apart. But the song itself, "The Miller's Son," right? "The Miller's Son" is effectively in song form, and in 1970 something, I think, what would eventually come out with, what is it, Everything Everywhere All at Once. And the one thing that I think is from that, and I could be wrong, but I think it's from that, of the, I wish in another life I would have liked to have just washed laundry with you. I think that's, it's something along those words, right? But it's this whole idea of like that sometimes just being able to exist with another person is enough, right? And that is what Petra is going through, right? Or where Petra is this person who could live a life like Madame Armfeld has, where Madame Armfeld has been playing counts and playing viscounts and playing dukes and emperors and whatnot, to get what she wants and to do anything that she wants to then secure a life for her in her old age, right? But with Petra, she basically lays out three futures for herself, right? She can marry the miller's son, which I'll talk about last. She can marry the businessman, and in marrying the businessman, Petra will have a fulfilling life. She'll get to have, a couple of kids, maybe 5 kids, 4 kids, 5 kids, 6 kids. She'll be comfortable. They'll be, they'll have some property. They'll be enjoying life. But, the hard part is that, well, it becomes her whole life then, is this family. And the fun things in life, the dancing of the world, well, that will only become something that they get to do when they have time, and they can find time to do it, right? She then lays out this third option, which is she can marry the Prince of Wales, who, right, will give you everything. Well, you'll get to have all the materialistic things in the world. You'll get to enjoy life as much as you want, But the problem becomes that the only times that you get to do all these fun things is when it is part of a job, right? It's the whole thing of don't make your hobby your job, because if that becomes your job, you're going to start hating it, right? And so that's kind of the other world that she lays out. Or she can go with her first option, which is to marry the miller's son, right? Which is just marry someone who does not necessarily give you anything inherently monetarily, right? But would give you so much happiness and so much ability to choose how you want to live in your world, that you get to go dancing whenever you want, that you get to go drinking whenever you want, that you get to go have sex whenever you want, right? And there's no bars to hold you in choosing how to live your life, right? Instead, you get to choose to enjoy yourself and have fun, right? And that becomes the huge thing, the huge idea behind Miller's Son. So yeah. The play itself, it's a comedy, or the musical, it's a comedy. It is very funny in a lot of ways, but it's also just such a downer in so many ways, and is also so there are parts of it that are just so the whole relationship aspect of it, which is just hard to get through sometimes. But yeah. I think I've been talking for 25 minutes. I think that is it for a little night music. Yeah, yeah.